So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that you will probably agree that all the panels and working group sessions that we have heard so far have provided a very comprehensive, very productive look at how digital transformation is occurring all across the formal and informal education chain. And certainly our discussions have underlined that when we talk about that entire education experience, we are talking about a lifelong experience. Learning is no longer, if it ever was, a one-time affair. So education that truly paves the way for a digital future must be lifelong. That's been really something that's been emphasized by many of the speakers we've heard here over the past 2 days. In this final forum on digital transformation of lifelong learning, that's our title, we want to try to tie together what we've heard over the past 2 days. What we're not going to do, although we have representation from all 4 of the panels, we are not going to stay in what Professor Hesse talked about as boxes. We're going to try to really get entirely out of the boxes and focus on overarching goals and principles that can guide the transformation of lifelong learning. And I want to do that with reference to the key principles and propositions of the Berlin Consensus, because they do, in fact, cut across many of these different phases and boxes that we've talked about. So we have a fantastic panel here to go on this exploration with us. And I'll just remind you who our panelists are. For panel 1, at this side of the panel, we have Eckhard Winter, who is the managing director of the Deutsche Telekom Stiftung. Next to him, representing panel 2 on higher education. If you remember, that first panel was a digitally enhanced classroom that Eckhard Winter chaired. So panel 2, we have Elijah Bitanga-Ndemo, who's assistant professor at the University of Nairobi and former permanent secretary at Kenya's Ministry of ICT. For panel 3 on the digital transformation of companies, represented here by Irene Bercek, who is head of the research department ICT at the Center for European Economic Research, whose acronym in German is ZEW. And finally, panel 4 on informal education. It's great to have Susanna Walsh back with us on the stage from the Gates Foundation. So we definitely want your input, ladies and gentlemen, throughout the panel. I'm going to try to take questions as they come in, and you know about the Pigeonhole tool. I don't have to remind you, and we've also got these for you. I would like to start out with category 1 in the Berlin Consensus, which is basically the category of mindset and skills. And I'm going to just put questions out there and ask whoever wants to address them to give me a sign. And short answers would allow for more dialogue, so they are very, very welcome indeed. First thing, and this came up in Suzanne's panel just now, the consensus refers to a focus on agility and creativity as being at least as important as material resources, including technology. This is in the section on mindset and skills. So there's a reference to agile working. What would you say that means in practice, in your experience? Where have you seen examples of agile working that you think could provide a basis to build on for future? Anybody want to pick up on that one? Eckhard Winter?
Well, I think schools have to change completely to adopt this agility. We saw this example of Agora in Holland yesterday. So you have to drop subjects. You have to learn by problems, by solving problems. And I think, at least in some countries like Germany, the tradition is in the way of agility. And that brings me to mindset, because we learned that resistance, inertia, teacher beliefs, and mental models are so strong that's very hard to overcome them. So also for schools, I think we need some kind of implementation science to be more agile in the future.
Anybody else want to speak to that? Mr. Ndemo? It's on. Go ahead, it's on.
One of the biggest problems is policymakers. There are so many policies governing education at the moment, And some have to be revised so that they can be in line with the current status where things change so frequently. And it takes so long to take a bill through Parliament in most parliaments. In our case, it takes almost a year. And by then, people have forgotten the whole purpose of trying to do it. Then academia, we contribute to this lack of agility by focusing too much, saying we have to do research and create and get evidence. And even though we know that some studies, like the studies that we've listened to here, we could, based on the findings, we could actually begin implementation or some pilot.
So you're telling us essentially that we also need agile structures, agile policy frameworks, and not simply agile pupils and schools. Anybody else?
Agile academicians.
Yeah, maybe if I think of companies as the environment, my impression is that IT companies are those that are most digitalized compared to companies in other sectors, and they often apply agile working sets, yeah. And so I think other companies or companies from other sectors could learn from that. But as we heard yesterday, also managers and CEOs are key to allow for such changing environments. So they are key in giving good examples by themselves, yeah, by being agile and being on the learning track themselves, and also allowing an agile environment or creative environment to their employees.
I think that agile learning means being able to apply knowledge in multiple contexts. And yesterday we heard Harold talk about the idea of coding for everyone is not a concept, it's a Band-Aid or a shortcut. And I think we have to be cautious about when we are talking about skills that can be applied in multiple contexts. That's what I think of it, agile learning. I can apply skills in multiple contexts. I'm not just learning something just as a shortcut, just as something to apply to one single problem. So agile learning, I think, is that ability to apply across multiple settings.
Let me pick up on that particular aspect. When we talk about skills, have we heard a really compelling definition of what digital skills are?
Well, I think on the gentleman, the students asked this question earlier. We were challenged with this, and the answer from my panel was, it's the same skills. Was it 40,000 years ago? I don't remember the time frame. 40,000 years ago, and so I don't know that we've made a distinction, and I don't know whether it's important to make a distinction because those key skills sort of are related to working in a digital environment as well as working in an analog environment. I don't know that I'm pressed to want to do that.
Maybe it's part of those skills are very traditional, but should be emphasized more, like arts, like creativity, but also problem solving is computational thinking. We heard yesterday. So. That's certainly a modern skill we need more, which can be anchored in mathematics and informatics in the school curriculum. So it's a diversity of skills. We need social skills, soft skills, more than ever.
So maybe what we don't need is the label digital skills.
Well, I think it's a question. I think that if you, we heard this, I think, as an intro yesterday, too. When you ask students, I think specifically sort of high school and maybe primary school students about digital learning, it's not even an idea for them. The concept of digital learning, it's just,
right.
What? I'm just learning, or I'm just using whatever the technology. So I think it is one of these things that if you weren't sort of born digitally, well, can you say that? Anyway, you know what I mean. If you're not a digital native, I think that it's a question that you ask, and if you're a digital native, it's just that's how the world operates, and so why the distinction?
Right.
Yeah, maybe one further point is that self-determination becomes more important as a skill for everyone, students, also employees, and that still We need more interdisciplinary knowledge, yeah? Not only engineering, but also software skills, not only analyzing data, but also being able to interpret the results. And at the same time, we need to, students need to learn how to, that was said yesterday, dive deeply into a subject. Yeah? So whatever it is, or whatever comes up during the working life.
Mr. Ndema?
I tend to think that humans are very complex, that what we think that we provide digital skills, there is no defined way of doing it other than access. I say this because there are some applications now which are used by both literate and illiterate people in my country, simply because there was access. They have access to broadband, access to the mobile, and they're able to use it to get money. Those are digital skills, but nobody actually sat them down to teach them the skills. So I look at that question from the point of access, and it's one of the 5 areas that we're looking at. If you provide access, human beings would figure out how to use it no matter what, if they have a purpose for that.
Thank you. In terms of general 40,000-year-old skills, one that would be very high on my list as a journalist, as an American, and as a mother would be critical thinking and the ability to weigh evidence, exactly for the reasons that Rushhold also talked about. What convincing approaches have you seen in your work toward inculcating that ability, be it formally or informally? Anybody?
I think in Germany we have a very good arena of initiatives for science and research learning outside schools. So inquiry-based learning has to be inside schools, but also outside schools, in universities, in companies. And that's why it is so important that schools open up and peer out of the box and link into non-formal and informal settings where this inquiry-based learning is possible and works better than maybe in the school system itself. I am lucky that I went to school in the US and I teach in Africa. The US, one of the courses you must do is critical thinking, and in some cases design thinking and stuff. And the systems that we adopted in most countries, they don't inculcate that in the systems. I'm not saying they're not creative people, but it sure helps to have such course at university level, and to trigger that creativity. And I think it can only be done at university level. And we've been advocating that we need to have such courses in our curriculum, but we are strictly under the British system, and I'm still trying to find out where the British put it, whether it's in primary or in, yeah.
Irene Bercek, you undoubtedly are cognizant of the discussion here in Germany about whether there need to be mandatory courses in media use. And where would you come down on that? And isn't that possibly an area that could equally well be addressed with a good basic course in elementary principles of critical thinking?
Yeah. Well, mandatory courses of media use. I think it's useful to learn how to deal with media and with content, and that students should learn, not only students, everybody should learn not to rely on one source, yeah. So, for example, only on Facebook. Yeah. And as researchers, we are used to consult different sources to make up our minds about a specific topic. So this should be learned. Media courses only make sense if they are regularly adapted to new technologies, new skills, and so on. So, as we heard yesterday, education is too slow, in fact, for digitalization and to keep pace with digitalization. So, if we are able to create concepts of media courses that adapt to this technological progress and to this progress of content, then it is very useful.
Speaking of adaptation of courses, I'd like to come back, before we leave this first area of the Berlin Consensus, come back to something that I think Eckhard Winter said at the outset regarding the slow pace of change in curricula, and ask about the tension between curricula and customization, because a number of you have talked about the new opportunities for customization, and on the other hand, do we then jettison curricula altogether? The Berlin Consensus refers to continual updating of curricula. What are the challenges that are involved there, and how do we overcome them? Anybody? Suzanne?
So I think in the United States, the most nimble higher education institutions in terms of responding to the demands of employers are the community colleges. And they have very strong, those who are best at this have really strong relationships with local employers. And so the local employer can say to them, we need more nurses with the following skills. And the community college is able to quickly respond and adjust curriculum with input from an advisory group of employers. I think those sorts of serious partnerships where you can say, I have this immediate demand, and sometimes it means that the community college creates a certificate program to respond to a really sort of fast-moving need. But having that constant employer relationship and partnership, I think, is very important. It's the only way to speed it up a little bit in the US, quite frankly, because the employer says, I have a need now. But also, it's a realistic request from a customer, as it were, of those colleges to say, this is what we need, and here are the things that we're looking for. But the challenge for the employer is to be able to describe what they're looking for in a way that then is translatable into curriculum. It's not always translatable, but I think if that's possible, those are kind of the best examples for me.
I think Eckhard Winter, and then I'll come to you.
In Germany, we left this term of curriculum to a certain extent because our orientation is to competencies. And when you work on problems, the curriculum is less important. In these extreme cases like Agora, curriculum doesn't make sense anymore. Because development of curricula is much too slow to adapt to the speed of development in the digital world. So competencies, skills are important, and that's a shift which is also slow in our system. It's there, it's written, but it's not adopted by all the Länder. We have this federal system with 16 states within Germany, different speed in between them. But we are on that way to leave the notion of curriculum.
Yeah, I think given the fact that people spend so much of their time in the labor market when they've left formal education, and I think a responsibility of companies is nowadays much higher than it was 2 or 3 decades ago. So a lot of learning takes place within the companies, and I agree that maybe the connection or giving feedback to schools and higher educational institutions to adapt to the needs of the working world might be quite difficult. So a lot has to take place within the firms.
I think we need, I'll be interested to learn from the German system, because there's a whole system of regulatory framework and also accreditation And that's where we are stuck in that maze, even though we know that we actually need to change and move forward. How we can disrupt the regulatory processes, I don't know. I don't.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Suzanne?
Well, this idea that curriculum is no longer relevant and that competencies are, the new currency, I think is really, it's very provocative. I think it's exactly the right conversation. But I'm thinking about it in terms of Lauren's presentation yesterday, Lauren and Richard's presentation yesterday.
Yeah.
If faculty members think that they own content, what does this do to the role of the faculty member when we say it's not about content, it's about competencies?
Yes, great. That's exactly where I want to go, in fact, into the next item. But Eckhard Winter, did you want to add to that, or? Go ahead.
I mean, the aspect of disciplines, of subjects in schools is very important. We learned about interdisciplinarity yesterday, and problems don't come in challenges. The big challenges don't come in disciplines.
Right.
They are interdisciplinary by nature.
Tell that to all the ministries and commission departments and so on out there. So I'd like to move into, in fact, the structural area. The Berlin Consensus also has a whole section on structures, and it talks there, among other things, about the need for strong, not only IT, so technology structures, but of course training and support structures, including staff development teams. We heard that great working group number one look at what is working and not working at Carnegie Mellon. I'd like to take it a bit beyond that and ask what evidence you have seen of what works in terms of support for helping staff, educational staff, make changes, be flexible, be agile. We heard Richard say it's about love in the end. It's not about material incentives. So love is a great thing to go by, but what else?
From my experience, you really have to be a revolutionary to change this, because we are still stuck with those seminars, consultants coming to tell us, and sometimes consultants have no idea, and even the person who is crafting the course you are going to go through is a procurement officer. Structures are a problem. I mean, we need, if there is something that needs to be disrupted in the educational systems, is that let the academic staff decide. But sometimes we are called for a training program, and it's useless, and nobody attends. So we actually need to begin to define what defines us in the days to come, and develop it together, other than what the institutions decide that we are going to take you through this program and stuff like that. So if in digital area, it is the lifelong learning that has helped, where you do it by yourself. You can never get it through the institutions. They have not woken up. It's not in their mental space.
May I just ask you a follow-up question on that? Because you said it in the panel yesterday as well. Essentially, given your experience, as I understand it, with the shortcomings of policymakers and policy frameworks, and perhaps also educators at times, you've essentially said a number of times, give people the resources and they will make something out of them. Yet we heard today from working group number 2 that hasn't always been as effective as was hoped. You know, the idea, let's take some small, easy to work with computers to African school kids and see what happens, that the results were perhaps not always as productive as had been hoped. What would you say to that? And if there could be supporting structures put into place to make them more effective, what should those look like, given the various shortcomings you've talked about?
Actually, I can say here that everything that I did that succeeded, I broke the law. And it's because you get frustrated in the process, and have seen donor money come to teach young people about entrepreneurship, and they have grand ideas, a consultant and everything, spend about $5 million, and the same kids who went through that program which did not succeed, I say, let's sit down here on YouTube and make banana bread, because there are too many bananas in where we are. Yeah. And we make the bread and they sell it. Very simple, but the donor agencies are stuck that you need a structure that has somebody to look at this, and by the time you finish, you have spent all the resources doing that. So that's why I'm saying that we need to break that system, the structure thinking, and make it, I don't know how that can be done, but that's how things work. We have helped young people set up enterprises out of YouTube without cost. But if you look at the amount of money that have been spent on helping young people create enterprises, it runs into billions. So you ask yourself, when will they listen and look at this? That is the biggest problem that we have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think, Vinter, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, when it comes to staff development, I think it's the answer is on the one hand very easy and on the other hand very complicated. What we need is a culture of sharing, which is facilitated by digital tools. And that means peer coaching, peer learning, reverse coaching. We heard that from industry yesterday, that there is reverse mentoring, that CEOs are mentored by their employees, things like that. But that comes, then we come back to the mindset of teachers, a changing role, which is also mentioned in the paper, non-traditional role of the teacher, more as a guide and not as an instructor. And that makes things very difficult to do, but the concept is very easy. That's the culture of sharing in the institutions and beyond.
And to build on Richard's love and appreciation for faculty, I think that including faculty from the beginning in any kind of change process is critical. So not doing things to the faculty or for them, but with them, I think is absolutely essential. So in the work that we do at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, when we work with institutions that have been incredibly effective with their faculty, it's because the faculty have had a voice from the beginning. Sometimes it's a little bit of a cantankerous voice, but their voice is heard and they're engaged from the beginning. And not necessarily having the external consultants come in, but actually thinking about faculty from other institutions as coaches, I think is another really important component of that.
Can I also just ask you a follow-up question on what we heard from Mr. Dedemo regarding what you might call donor bias or structural biases arising from donor focus? So question would also be Agile donors. How do you deal with that? I know it's come up with the Gates Foundation in the medical arena, and I don't want to take us too far in that direction, but looking at this in the educational arena.
Oh yeah, so we get this in the educational, we get this especially in our work with K-12, which has really had a heavy policy emphasis for something called the Common Core, which sounds fantastic because it really is about basic skills and how do you think about the competencies for K-12 students? But the way that it came across, I think, in the way that we approached our work there, and this is true in a number of areas for us, is that it comes across as we are dictating what we think the world should be from Seattle or from one of our offices somewhere else. And we've had to learn over time, and we're trying to get better. We actually do a grantee perception survey. So we know, we get the feedback very directly. We publish it. And so part of what we've been working on is really trying to be, in fact, better listeners, better collaborators. And we've never gone into sharing what we've learned in a way that we mean to come across as so dictatorial, but we have a position, I mean, the money gives us a position of power. And so we are really trying to do much more collaborative, on-the-ground learning from the beginning. However, that being said, in higher education, this is a big issue in the United States right now, especially with very large donors. It's very hard to say if somebody wants to give you many, many millions of dollars for a very specific thing, like a new sports field. It's very hard to say, no, I would like that for the philosophy department. It just doesn't quite work. And so I think we're going to see quite a bit of activity as colleges and universities, starting with the faculty, are starting to question the role of donors and how do you push back with donors and how do you get that sort of agility?
So I've got a lot of questions coming in now. I've got one up here that also goes to a structural aspect that is mentioned in the Berlin Consensus, which we've touched on in the cross-cultural setting and a little bit in the other settings, but it's among other things, also an access and inclusion issue. So the question is this: when I take these audience questions, I'm going to say that not everybody needs to answer every question, or we won't, unfortunately, get to them all. But this question is education that liberates, also potentially alienates from the status quo, perhaps you could say also from your origins sometimes, as we help individuals to self-determine their path. Should we understand and help them with cultural implications? Anyone have a thought on that? Maybe Mr. Nadimo?
Yes, and I think you saw it play here yesterday. When we were talking about higher education, we were saying MOOCs don't work. Today, when we were discussing about informal education, MOOCs were being talked about. And also the presentation from Amy and Judith, although very expensive to implement, it says a lot. And I think we need to find ways of how can we scale a study like that one. I think those are the areas we need to look at. Yes, education liberates and sometimes alienates others from the systems. Not just along the cultural lines, but because, as I said yesterday, it's because the studies that were done here were generalized across the world. I think we need more contextual studies also to be taken into account.
Thank you very much. I've got two questions here that refer to essentially workplace issues. So Irene Bercek, maybe you want to take a shot at them. And also Eckhard Winter. Here's the first one. How does workplace culture need to change to enable faster individual and organizational learning? And I'm going to, well, there's a second one. Can you both remember that for a moment while we look at this second one as well, and maybe then you can address both of these points. Second one is this: the concept of empirical evidence-based models that replace expert opinion is a powerful one in teaching. Should we also seek it in models for professional development? So, workplace culture changes to foster faster individual and organizational learning, and then how do we incorporate this focus on empiry and evidence also within professional settings? So, Irena?
Yeah, I try to start. So how should workplace culture change? I mean, in fact, we already discussed this a little bit with the first question on the mindset, right? If we change the mindset and try to get more agile, this is also related to workplace culture. I mean, we know from economic research that investment in technology should be complemented by investment in organizational capital and human capital, and this is somehow related, yeah? So there is empirical evidence for that. And so how can we do that? If managers are flexible, if they allow flexibility to their employees and self-determination, responsibility, this can help to also make the workplace culture change. Now, with respect to the empirical evidence-based models, I mean, evidence-based models are crucial, yeah, to understand how learning works. And I think this is also one point that we need more research and more assessment of learning concepts. I mean, I'm not an education researcher, so maybe others here in the room can contribute to this question much more. But I think if we develop new learning concepts, we also have to assess their outcome, yeah. And and this is something that we need also for professionals, for employees, if they use new tools. Are these tools really worth it? Do they help? Is the outcome, with respect to productivity, efficiency, innovativeness, and so on, really helpful?
That certainly holds true for other areas, and we haven't talked much about professional development of teachers, and there is much evidence now, and these evidence-based models should enter continuous professional development of teachers, but we don't have the time to sit in the ivory tower. So new ways of, like design-based research was mentioned yesterday, where scientists learn together with the practitioners, and I think that's very important to be more agile in this field as well.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put a question up here that I'm going to answer, and I'm going to essentially take this just as a suggestion. Yes. Yes, I think so. I think the more we can create new conference formats that get real interaction going between all of us, the better. And anybody disagree? Anybody out there disagree? Okay. Let's move on to another question that essentially also addresses structures, literally physically. Who's going to rebuild all the schools and university buildings for more agile teaching paradigms? Or let's just say for different approaches than the ones we have now, because universities and schools often have millions and billions of infrastructure backlogs. Is there anyone on the panel who wants to try to address that? Because indeed, to what degree, I guess the real question is, to what degree does physical infrastructure act as an obstacle?
Well, I think what we saw, was it called Agora? Yesterday. I mean, that physical setting, I loved that the gentleman also said that it creates a sense of wonderment or wonder when you enter the room, and I think the physical setting really does matter. I mean, we've all been very excited about this physical setting. It's bright. If we had been in a place with no windows, I think we all would have passed out by now. We may not have lasted this long. So, you know, the importance of a physical setting, I think, matters. What we've seen in terms of who's doing this well right now, we've seen quite a few colleges and universities completely redoing their libraries so that in the United States, so that the library is no longer a quiet place for books. It is a place to interact in open spaces. They've learned a lot from places like, you know, the Apple Store and other co-working spaces so that it's public, it's lively, it's a cafe. And so I don't know that there are costs associated with that, but that's different than building a brand new building. I think there are ways of using old spaces in new ways and moving some of those pieces of furniture, quite frankly, around to be able to create a new environment that's more engaging.
I think it's very important to include architecture in the whole view of the digital world, because digital education, I don't like this term. It's not just iPads and computers, it's built environment for learning. And we are missing a chance in Germany at the moment, because in cities growing like Berlin, there is a high demand of new school buildings, and there is even the money for that, but they are built on old plans, on traditional plans that are in the bureaucracy safe, and that's it. So we will see the same lecture theaters as we did 30 years ago. And I think it's very, very important to put emphasis on this aspect of the built environment for teaching and learning.
Briefly?
I just wanted to add that wherever there is a will, there is a way. 2-3 years ago, our president said he wanted to give laptops to grade 1 kids. And everybody said, oh, there is no electricity in the rural areas. 2 years down the road, every school has electricity in the very remote parts. So often what used to happen is that this will be too expensive. Who would give us money from, which donor would give us money? Then we spend time thinking about the resources. So if you really want to do it, it can actually be done even by the parents bringing the resources together to build those schools.
You're definitely the voice of resourcefulness on our panel. I've got a couple of different inputs that I'd like to just read off as good impulses, good inputs, and then move on to just a couple more questions because we're rapidly running out of time here. So here's one: students teaching students while supported by a teaching guide, an approach where we're constantly either learning or teaching, or both, of course. Is that a good approach to lifelong learning? I doubt anybody is on this panel who would say no. So here's another one. Is not education a value in itself, which should not be too quickly given up for usefulness and agility? Again, people nodding. I think we can just let that stand. There's a couple of MOOC questions. We did a lot on MOOCs. I think I'm not going to take those questions right now. Let me come to another aspect of the structures discussion in the Berlin Consensus, and it relates to collaborative culture and something that all of us know from working with young people, the proclivity for borrowing, in other words, what we used to call plagiarizing, and intellectual property structures. To what degree, when we talk about legal frameworks, policy frameworks that need to change, is this a crucial area that is holding us back in relevant ways?
I think we have an ongoing discussion on that in Germany at the moment because we have this digital strategies of the Länder and the federal government. I'm unfortunately not an expert in that field, but open educational resources and intellectual property rights, it's very important because teachers don't know how to handle that. They need a clear direction in that field, but we are in the process of developing that. I don't know the situation in other countries.
Anyone else?
I had assumed that we learn from German with respect to Creative Commons. I don't know whether I'm wrong, that you practice more Creative Commons than IP in German. And I think it's the best way because it's much more a relaxed way of protecting your intellectual property. I think, and we've been saying Germany is doing it, and we should be doing it here. That's what I think. I don't know anybody can say anything about it.
And it's a big challenge for the publishers, of course.
Yeah.
And I hate to bring up MOOCs, but but I will. But I think this is a very interesting question because what is using a MOOC but a form of plagiarizing? I mean, I'm going to take this thing created by somebody else and I'm going to use it in my classroom as if it were mine. And we actually reward that behavior. We think that this is a good idea when somebody is taking and reusing someone else's work. And so I think that especially current sort of high school age students, it's very confusing that you know that this may be happening. How do you, but I can't use somebody else's thing. So how do you actually help students to make, back to your media question, I mean, making good decisions and understanding when and how to use information is really a key skill.
Thank you very much. Let me go on to another audience question, which takes us into the next category in the Berlin Consensus, which is drivers. What are going to be the drivers of change going forward, and what kind of inspiration or challenges do they pose? So here's one on the question of the thoughts on startups and their role in driving changes in education. And I might add to that a question which essentially is raised in the Berlin Consensus concerning who are likely to be the next big new actors. Please, Mr. Nademo, and then, yeah.
Actually, yesterday I pointed to a Kenyan startup, Enesa.
Yeah.
And I think these are the ones, the names, you probably won't hear Microsoft, but you would hear such big, small names becoming big. My thinking is that we are just almost about to see a disruption in education, especially with startups around education, because they are perfecting, improving, and we are seeing adoption rates going high. And it's just a matter of time. We would probably see some big startup in education across the world, just like Khan Academy has succeeded.
Irina Berchet, you wanted to add?
I mean, if you think of startups not only as a provider of education, but as an environment, for learning also, they are often less traditional, less conservative, and they live this sharing and learning from each other. Still, there is evidence showing that mixed teams are important for a successful startup. So you're having only creative people from one discipline is not necessarily the ground for a successful company that survives for 3 or 5 years, but you have to have a mixture of skills within the founding team in order to be successful. And I think this is also important. I mean, we said that mixed teams are important for learning. They are also important for having success in the economy.
I think the importance of EdTech startups is growing, and there will be a startup safari, because in Berlin is a center for these EdTech startups, and they will grow in importance. They have already conquered the afternoon, so to speak, the private tuition market, which is a big market in this country and other countries. But I think they will grow in importance, are certainly drivers in modern forms of using data and so on.
Thank you very much. Let me take us on to the final section of the Berlin Consensus, which is a really broad section, a really important section, but I just perhaps want to ask you to highlight 1 or 2 things. It's new pedagogic teaching concepts and evidence, and I'd like to take one audience question here to get us started, which perhaps is not directly under this roof, but kind of. Namely, how can Agile research look also in terms of openness to the public, communication of results, and transfer to practice? So essentially also getting at that evidence issue and communicating, including communicating science. Anybody? I mean, in a way, it also falls into your informal education bracket. If
Put it on the
sure.
Sorry.
Maybe I start. Well, I would say research is agile. So usually we are keen on communicating research results. We are putting them online as discussion papers or as releases for press, for the media, so everybody can look at the results. So I would say there is already, I mean, research is already a field that is quite agile and open, because we need to discuss results to have controversial discussions and to have controversial insights also.
But researchers are not always adept at communicating to the public in ways that the public really can take in, or not.
Now, if I'm thinking of CW as our institute, we do it. It's one of our main goals to do that. So, but I agree that not every researcher, maybe, or not every discipline, or depending on whether you work in an institution that is publicly funded or only in a university that is focusing on research, this might be different. And also to find the right wording for communicating results. is not an easy task. So.
The public understanding of science debate dates back to the 90s, and I think we made quite some progress, also due to organizations like the AAAS. But the new thing, and Rush Holt mentioned that, is citizen science, because that's public understanding of science, and that scientists talk to people is one thing, but participation and really participating in ongoing research, that's a new thing, and that is enabled by digital technologies. So you can be a part of a big science project at CERN, for example, as a student in school. So that's really new and promising.
I think it's an interesting area where actually journalists and scientists could be working together. And I think AAAS even has an initiative working with science writers, because not all journalists can communicate the science either. So we're we're missing an interpreter somewhere in there, a translator to help improve this sort of openness, because the information could be open. There was a study a number of years ago where a database of information related to HIV and AIDS was opened up worldwide, and everybody said, oh, this is going to change everything. Well, it only really changed things for the same researchers who had already been using it. It wasn't put in a format that would be accessible. So thinking about those partnerships outside of science to help with the communications could be great.
I would just add that the work like Sanjay Gupta does goes to extract that from the researchers and then actually presents it in a format that the public can understand the research.
Well, we saw it yesterday. There was a video of the gentleman teaching mathematics and then and Ask the Scientist or whatever that other one was. So I think individuals are starting to try to translate, I think, these concepts as well. So this is an informal learning and informal tutoring opportunity.
May I ask if there's anybody out there who is burning to ask a question with one of these? We are unfortunately out of time, but if there's one really pithy question out there, I'll try to work it in. And otherwise, I have one final question for all of you with an absolutely enormous universal scope, but I'm going to ask you to answer it as briefly as you can. And it's an area that comes up in the Berlin Consensus a couple of times, and it's the idea that all of this kind of education that we're talking about, when we talk about paving the way for a digital future, that we're also in some sense talking about education as a basis, as a springboard for something we might think of as global citizenship. So a big aspiration. What would be really crucial to create that kind of a basis going forward, if you can just reduce it to a few basic ideas or principles? And I'll just go right down the panel. And maybe we've said all the things that are part of this, but yeah.
Maybe we need something like a global curriculum for the grand challenges, like the Sustainable Development Goals. That would be wonderful to have that handled and dealt with in schools all over the world. And the grand challenges are there. They can be defined, and it's problem-oriented, and it's challenging, and it's motivating for young people.
I would agree with him, but then we start from science. If you go to history, the whole thing will die because everybody have their own way of thinking. But look at some of the math which is online, which everybody talks about globally. So if we begin with science slowly, we can eventually build a global citizenships.
Yeah, I also think that we should start in a small environment, like in a specific type of subject, like math or so. and if you look at Germany, we could also start by putting more weight to the federal state level in organizing education and not leaving it to 16 sub-states.
I may be biased, but I think informal education, I think has a really important role, because what we heard from each of the panelists, Barbara and Thomas and Florian and Pierre, and Rush kicked us off by saying, you know, informal learning is learning by choice, and to help people to become, you have to first decide, I want to be a global citizen. How do we partner across countries, which we heard a lot about on that panel? How many countries had said, oh, we're going to partner students from Africa with students from Germany? Those are that's not two countries, I know that, sorry about that. But if I'm working with Nigeria and Germany, or partnering students even within the refugee camps was very interesting. So there's something about informal learning that allows us to take responsibility for each other and to help each other sort of come along. If we're all going to be committed to being global citizens, we all have to be committed to helping each other to become global citizens, and perhaps an informal environment is the best way to do that.
Thank you very, very much to all of you. Please let's give them a very warm round of applause.